Welcome to Chapter 1, Part 2, where we discuss the costs of addiction. In this presentation, we'll take a look at social costs, economic issues, how healthcare is involved, weighing the costs versus benefits, personal costs experienced, and we'll also take a look at alcohol use prevalence throughout the United States. So just looking at the financial cost to society, NIDA estimates that every year $740 billion is lost because people miss work, commit crimes, use the healthcare system, and need treatment related to addiction. So that's nearly $1 trillion of value. Now, in terms of healthcare and alcohol use, people who have alcohol problems disproportionately use healthcare and emergency services. And in fact, even though people with alcohol use disorder only represent about 10% of the population, they represent 20% of the hospitalizations. So by a 2-to-1 factor, people who have alcohol use problems are using hospitals and emergency services. Even people who are family members of those with alcohol problems have higher use of healthcare themselves. They experience more injuries, more mental health problems, and so they also need additional services. Taking a look at some of the personal costs, and again, these are consequences that people experience. Even if you don't have an addiction, alcohol can still be a very significant factor when it comes to injuries, falls, suicide. Crime is more associated with alcohol than any other drug. We often think of heroin and cocaine, illegal drugs, when it comes to crime, but alcohol is involved in more crimes than any of the other drugs. We just talked about how intense the healthcare costs are. Burns and fires are also related to alcohol use. Motor vehicle crashes and fatalities, boating accidents, and also domestic and interpersonal violence. So when it comes to economic considerations, there must be something going on that we as a society have decided we want to have alcohol be part of our society. And of course, there is an entire industry that benefits from it. It's interesting though, when you look at the costs we just discussed, the healthcare costs, the lost work and productivity, crime and injuries experienced, and then you weigh those against the benefits that we get, such as having a hospitality industry, the tax revenues that states bring in from alcohol sales. What's estimated is that for each dollar that we get back as a society in taxes, we end up spending $10 in costs that we just discussed. So how prevalent are alcohol problems? About 8% of people age 12 or older in the United States have an alcohol problem. About 17% of those, or roughly 1 in 6 of those people with an alcohol problem, also have a drug problem, so they have a secondary problem in addition to that. In surveys, 1 in 3 people report that they have a family member who has an alcohol problem. So we know that this is a deeply rooted issue that affects tens of millions of Americans. This is certainly not just an isolated problem. In some ways, we might be able to say drugs are just bad. They cause all kinds of problematic side effects. They can lead to tolerance and withdrawal. In some cases, they create addiction, which can cause a lifetime of problems. And as a society, we become very reliant on using different types of pills to treat all kinds of different issues. At the same time, we can say drugs are really good. They provide tremendous pain relief if we have an injury or surgery or other type of procedure. They're used in mental health treatment. Non-addictive drugs are very useful as antibiotics, cancer treatments, for AIDS and all kinds of common conditions. So they've become a significant part of society and part of our culture. I guess more than anything, what we can say is that drugs are complicated and our relationship with them is complicated. Of course, many people enjoy using drugs simply because it feels good to, it's pleasurable. And that's regardless of whether those drugs are legal or not. As pointed out before in Unit 1, Drugs have been part of human culture for thousands of years, and that's unlikely to ever change. Laws and cultural attitudes towards drugs do shift over time. So drugs that were once thought to be unacceptable might come into favor. Drugs that were once very popular in the past may become less popular. So we have a very complicated relationship with drugs of abuse, but I think it's one that's important to pay attention to and try to understand. Let's tell a quick story here that summarizes how people in America drink. And I give credit to Jean Kinney, the author of the book Loosening the Grip. She developed this story, and it's a nice way of understanding our cultural relationship with alcohol. So this is a tale of 10 beers. So you start out pretty simply imagining that you're going to a party, and there's 10 people at this party, and there's 10 beers to go around at the party. And the way these get broken down is as follows. First of all, 3 people at the party stand in a corner together and they have nothing to drink. They drink no beers. So there's 3 people drinking nothing. You have another 5 people who maybe sit at a table together and they split a total of 2 drinks among themselves. So those 5 people have a total of 2 drinks, not 2 each, but a total of 2 between all 5 of them. One person at the party goes off and drinks 2 drinks all by himself. And then the last person takes the final 6 drinks, and she has all 6 drinks by herself. So what does this tell us? Let's make some more sense of this party. So this party is actually how Americans drink every year over the course of a year. So about 1/3 of adults, that 30% who came into the party and didn't drink anything, they stay abstinent and don't drink the entire year. That might be for personal reasons. They just aren't interested in drinking, don't like it, don't want to. Might be for religious reasons. Several religious groups, such as Mormons, some Baptist churches, and Muslims, for religious reasons, don't drink alcohol. Some of that group that doesn't drink might also be in recovery. We had that middle group of 5 people sitting together. That's the 50%. That group of Americans drinks occasionally. They don't drink every day. They probably never binge drink. They don't get intoxicated. They only drink just once in a while, and they typically only have 1 or 2 drinks when they do. That's actually the largest of the groups. That one person who went off and had 2 drinks, that's the 10% of Americans who binge drink. Now, in this particular story, that person only had 2 drinks. But remember, this story plays out 365 times a year. So what's more likely to happen is that person drinks once or twice a week, and when he or she does, has 6, 7, or 8 drinks at a time. Now, a binge is defined as having 5 or more drinks on one occasion. So if you've ever had that, typically within a 2-hour period, you've experienced a binge, or if you know anyone who has. So at the party, that was 10%. And then that last person, that last 10% would be heavy drinkers. That was the person who had a 6-pack all by herself. And again, this plays out every single day of the year. So it's not just one time having a 6-pack. It's doing that the equivalent of 365 days a year. A heavy drinker is defined as someone who binges on a regular basis. So would have had 5 or more binges within the past month. So what's interesting in the United States is that if you look at our total consumption of alcohol, we actually drink less per person than most European countries where drinking is much more part of the culture. It's very big in the United States, but our relationship with it and our cultural norms are a little bit different. So in Europe, that 10 beers that we just talked about would be split up much more evenly, where 10 people would each be having 1 drink. In the United States, you saw it was really an unusual pattern where we have a lot of abstainers, we have a few social or occasional drinkers, and then we have a couple people who drink on the heavy side. So we end up having higher rates of binge drinking and more problems associated with alcohol, particularly drinking and driving in the United States. A lot of that probably has to do with the fact that our social norms or our rules about drinking tend to be unclear or send mixed messages. We typically tell our teenagers that they should never drink at all, and we don't allow them to drink with the family. But then when they go off to college, turn 18 or 19, we sort of set them free and we set no limits on their drinking. And we have young adults who are very susceptible to drinking too much, to drinking, trying to drink like their peers are drinking. And when they've had no experience with that, it puts them at very high risk. In European countries, they essentially have drinking integrated into their family life, and they teach their young people how to drink. I know that's a funny thing to say, but it's something we don't do in the United States at all. So when somebody turns 18, they have little or no experience with alcohol in many cases. In Europe, by age 18, most teenagers have been drinking with the family for several years, and they don't think as much about it. It's a very different cultural norm. So our cultural view of drugs definitely shapes the way we use and the kinds of drugs we use. If you think about nicotine and smoking, historically in the 1950s and 60s, a lot of Americans smoked. It was considered very normative. Close to 50% of the adult population smoked. Now less than 20% of the adult population smokes because we realize it's so harmful, and because we've actually gone out of our way to create laws and rules to limit people from smoking. It's become a very unpopular drug, an unaccepted drug, although it used to be accepted. Interestingly, in its place, marijuana over the last 10 or 20 years is gaining a lot more widespread acceptance, becoming legal, even as we push cigarette smokers out and don't allow them to smoke, which has done a good thing for public health without a doubt. But at the same time, now we are increasing marijuana use and seeing that become more normalized and more celebrated. Alcohol remains a very celebrated and popular drug in our culture. It's hard to think about parties and celebrations and commercials on TV without picturing alcohol. At the same time, nicotine has become a target for more and more regulation. In the past, heroin, cocaine, and amphetamine have all gone through different cycles of being popular, sometimes within celebrity culture and different types of music culture and things like that. And I feel like each one of those kind of goes through a rotation where they have a period of popularity and bigger use. So as cocaine use kind of dropped after the 70s and 80s and heroin use took over, it's certainly possible that that will change back again and that there'll be some other type of drug that's more popular in the future. The point here is just really to think about how our culture and our society, our media, how they depict certain drugs of abuse, whether we depict them as dangerous or safe, legal or illegal, popular or unpopular, and how that might affect our attitudes toward them, and how it might affect whether we use those drugs or not, and how we use those drugs as well.